Good afternoon and welcome. Sometimes there's a delay here, so just waiting a few moments to get started. Well, welcome. I am Holly Peipenberg from the Pulitzer Center. We'll get started here in a few minutes. For those who have not joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization based in Washington, D.C. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year on global and local issues. On our website, you can take a look under our reporting issues page where we bring together this work by themes, including racial justice, environment and climate change, and public health, among many others. We have developed a strong university program connecting journalists with college campuses in person and now virtually to engage with students. We also award reporting fellowships every year to students from our now more than 35 university partners. On the K-12 education front, we reach thousands of students and educators via class visits, online sessions, and professional development workshops. We also organize public events and webinars such as this one. You can find all the reporting and education resources on our website at pulitzercenter.org. Just a few logistics before we begin. We'll start with a conversation with our guests, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. You'll see a Q&A icon at your screen, probably at the bottom. You can begin adding your questions at any time throughout the remarks. Please go ahead and submit your question as soon as something comes to mind. There's also a chat icon on your screen, and we'd appreciate it if you would use the chat box for specific technology issues. Please note that all attendees are muted, but if you cannot hear us, let us know in that chat box. And we want you to know that we are recording this session to post online for others who could not join us today. And one final logistic note, please remember to stay online a few moments after the session ends to participate in a brief survey. Now I'd like to quickly introduce today's guests. Rachel Axon and Kyle Bagenstose, investigative reporters with USA Today. Chadde, Investigate Midwest managing editor and reporter. Domingo Garcia, national president of the League of United Latin American Citizens. And Roger Horowitz, historian and professor at the University of Delaware. So hello all. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited to learn more about your work. How about we start there? I'd like to invite the reporting team to share your project, especially for audience members who might not have had a chance to read your reporting.
Yeah, I'll start. I'm Chadde with the Midwest Center for Investigative Reporting. Today's actually a really good day to talk about this because it's been a full calendar year since the very first publicly known case of a meatpacking worker testing positive for coronavirus was known. So that first case was March 23rd, 2020. So a full year. So this kind of reporting project started pretty soon after that. After the first reported case, two major plants in the United States, the Smithfield Foods plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and then the JBS plant in Greeley, Colorado, had big outbreaks and ultimately had to close. And that's really what kind of got national attention brought onto this issue of meatpacking plants being hotspots for COVID-19. On the Midwest side, kind of before the partnership with USA Today happened, I started at the Midwest Center in October 2019. But before I got there, the newsroom had covered meatpacking plants. They were kind of familiar with the working conditions in these plants. People were very close together. The line speeds were really high, so people had a lot of repetitive stress motions. But anyway, we were familiar with these kinds of plants, and we were seeing outbreaks being reported around the country, and then we had these two high-profile closings. And that's when we decided, okay, what new thing can we bring to this? And so we decided to just start tracking all of these cases, as many as we could. through news reports, press releases from companies, state data. At that time, there really wasn't state data. So a lot of it was like news reports, press releases, just regular reporting, calling up plants, stuff like that. But so we started that in early April. And at the time, I mean, maybe it's kind of Pollyanna-ish to think now, but I thought like there would be outbreaks in like 10 meatpacking plants. And now there's like 500. So joke's on me. Anyway, like I don't think back then we really knew just how big of a problem this would be. But they quickly became that, and the scale of it was pretty evident by the end of April. And that's kind of what our first story was with USA Today, with kind of combining what our tracking had showed and doing a data analysis showing that this was probably going to get a lot worse.
All right, I think I'll kind of step in for USA Today. Again, my name is Kyle Bagenstose. I'm an investigative reporter. At USA, I think we kind of started focusing this originally as a consumer story. We had a reporter named Nathan Bomey on our business desk, and he kind of started kind of looking at it when there was all the talk of the potential shortages off of those early plant breakdowns. We've been investigative editor Chris Davis. I think he kind of saw the writing on the wall that this was maybe something right for investigation, not just business desk. So for some reason, he picked me out of the stable of writers. I'm an environmental person primarily. I haven't done a lot of ag or labor. So it was a new thing and figuring out a lot of where to look and who to talk to and what the data was. And I think as we started to do that, the coverage started shifting a little bit. The USDA puts out daily production numbers for their meatpacking plants. And we saw as much of a 40% dip, but it wasn't 100%, right? And a lot of the experts we talked to kind of said that, you know, they didn't see big shortages on the horizon. We had the Wendy's cheeseburger debacle, of course, where there wasn't cheeseburgers for a couple of days, but not that we were going to run out of protein. At the same time, you see leaders from some of these companies saying really interesting things. So Kenneth Sullivan, CEO of Smithfield Foods, says on April 6th that factory closures were pushing our country perilously close to the edge in terms of our meat supply. A couple of weeks later, you have John Tyson, chairman of Tyson Foods, put his name on a full-page ad in the Washington Post and New York Times, warning that America's food supply chain is breaking. And then, of course, you have the April 28th executive order from Donald Trump invoking the Defense Production Act to try and prop up these meat plants and give them some legal cover to stay open. So we see this kind of gap in what's the reality of the production. Okay, it's hit. There's some spot shortages. I'm sure people remember, you know, certain products not being available at the grocery store versus this, you know, huge fire alarm going off from some of these companies. It didn't really make a lot of sense. And we were able to kind of put out original nuanced reporting, kind of explaining this. I think things took an even bigger turn when I found the USDA also puts out export data, right? So how many pounds of beef and lamb and pork are going to be going overseas. And actually the export in that crucial time period of April, May was greater than the drop in production domestically between 2019 and 2020. So in other words, if you were to just take everything that was being exported, keep it domestically, you'd actually have more production in 2020 than there would be in 2019. So I started looking at that some more, talked to some experts and learned that basically China had been trying to build up its own domestic meat production over the past couple of years. And before we had our flu, there was a swine flu in China that wiped out a lot of their herds. So their domestic production was really down. At the same time, you have a bit of a thaw in the relationship between China and the US at the end of 2019. There were positive signs. So it looked like the meat industry was really looking at 2020, a potential banner year to be able to export a lot, build those relationships and make some money. And I think that starts to get at, you know, I mean, people in China are people too, of course, right? They have to eat too. So it's not so much that we need to hoard it here so we have cheeseburgers so that Chinese people can't eat, right? But it's about the justification being used to keep these plants not only open, but to keep them at near production, to keep some of them even speeding up production, right? When the industrial hygienists say you need to slow things down, you need to spread things out, that's going to cause a different production. So you have this justification that was kind of that was given for it that really wasn't adding up when you looked at the numbers. And I think that is even more when we started shifting away from this kind of consumer-based, you know, meat supply towards the relationship between labor and management at these companies. And it was right about then as well that I think Rachel kind of came onto our team and helped us make even more ground on that reporting. So I think I'll kick it to you, Rachel.
Sure. I'm Rachel Axon. I'm an investigative reporter with USA Today. Like Kyle, I did not have a background in covering ag. I actually have covered sports almost all of my career. So in COVID, we all became utility players. And Kyle's right. Around when I came onto the team is when the reporting was starting to shift from a consumer question to a worker safety questions. One of the first stories that they were far down the line on was basically, why meatpacking? And I hope that Roger and Domingo can speak a bit to this later, that these were becoming hotspots in the for spread of COVID in the country. Around that time in the spring, it was nursing homes, prisons, and meatpacking plants. And so we did reporting on why that is. What are the conditions in the plant typically? And this is an industry with a long history of worker safety issues. People are crowded in together. They're working at rapid speeds. So when you think about all of the things you've been told to do, distance from each other, don't breathe on each other. That's the workplace for these workers every day. When I came on the team, there were already thousands of cases, I think hundreds of plants where this was happening. And most of these plants are in pretty rural parts of the country. And so we just wondered, are the small local public health departments getting overwhelmed? Are they doing anything? And that's where we started to really dig in on records and targeted public records requests to public health departments in places where a meatpacking plant had more than 200 cases. That's gave us a lot of good information, but that's what led us to St. Joseph, Missouri, where we ended up digging in and investigating Triumph Foods. The records that we got there initially gave us a lot to offer. We knew that this was a plant with hundreds of cases. It had been reported publicly. Unlike most plants, Triumph had taken the step of testing its entire workforce, nearly 3,000 people, and found, I believe, more than 400 we knew at the time. And they did not close the plant at all. And all of this is happening around the time in late April when President Trump was signing the executive order declaring meatpacking plants essential. That was taken by the industry to mean we have to stay open, even though that's not what the order says. Those records also gave us something really important to dig into. Our editors, Kyle mentioned, Chris, was looking for, are there places where people have died, and can we tell what happened, what went wrong, what steps weren't taken, things like that. And in those initial records was an OSHA letter to the local public health department for information about a gentleman named Arturo Chavez Valencia, who had died of COVID. He was the first death at this plant and had died about a week before we put in that records request. So those records led us down the reporting path that would ultimately lead to our investigation. They pointed to the government response, not just from the local public health department, which was pretty lax and just took the company at its word, but also pointed us to the state health department, the authority that actually could have closed the plant but chose not to. Also led us to Missouri's Agriculture Department and Department of Economic Development, both of which sort of lobbied on behalf of the company to keep it open, to support it any way they could so that the plant wouldn't shut down. It also gave us insight into company response. Triumph Foods, like all these meatpacking companies, is a private company. And so we can't just go get their emails, but when they were corresponding with the public health department, that gave us some insight. We saw an early April email where the communications director was saying, there's an increase of strep throat. That's odd. And later, epidemiological reports from the state would show that at least some workers were symptomatic with COVID at that time. We saw other emails from a company executive lamenting that Triumph had even tested the entire workforce because they said everyone was asymptomatic, but now because we know that they're sick, we have to send them home. Now we're out 370 workers for the next couple of weeks. Those records also gave us a critical piece of information that helped us to report, especially so much of our reporting from this was happening remotely, right? We're still in a pandemic. We're not traveling for our company. We're all working from home. But that included a testing roster from one of the days from which we, I'm not exaggerating, made hundreds of phone calls because we were trying to talk to workers and to understand what was happening in the plant, What measures was the company taking? What were they not taking? What concerns did the workers have? How were they voicing those? And many of those we were able to see in the records, where people were emailing the public health department and saying, I'm being told to go into work sick, or my husband, or my significant other, all these sort of red flags and warning signs. These records also pointed us to get other medical and death records. As I mentioned, Arturo Chavez Valencia was the first person to die. He was one of the first to test positive, and he died very suddenly in his home. And so that meant EMS response, coroner report, anything like that to help us understand what happened. Thankfully, we were also able to speak to his widow, Gabriela Ramirez, who also works at that plant, but who told us about what she had done for weeks to try to keep her husband comfortable and take care of him. A lot of this remote reporting, unfortunately, in the time we were reporting this, more workers did die. So periodically I would spend, and I know Kyle and Sky did some of this too, hours checking obits of just the local funeral homes to see, was there anyone else additional that we could identify as potentially working at this plant. And then in speaking to workers, we were connected to a gentleman by the name of Bernardo Serpa. He was an immigrant from Cuba. And when I spoke with him with another reporter from the Midwest Center in July, he was in the hospital still after a month in a coma. He had turned 65 while he was in a coma. He had had organ damage, lost a significant amount of weight, and he was very frustrated with Triumph because he felt like they had just replaced him and not cared for the very serious illness he was going through. But critically, and I think this is one of the key things that we found, and Sky can in a minute here detail what our findings were in this reporting. He pointed us to what was maybe one of the most significant lapses that the company made is they did this testing, they tested the whole workforce, but then they sent people back in the plant before they knew who was sick and who was not. And so Bernardo tested negative, and Bernardo went back in the plant. And we talked to other people, and then the union says, and another worker told us, I was sick. I went home that day after I got tested. I came back to work, and 2 days later, they sent me home and said, oh no, you're positive. And so in terms of contributing to the spread, that really was a key finding of failings of the company, although I'll hand it back over to Sky to get in a bit more of what we found about their response.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. To Rachel's point, the company was really slow to implement protections for its workers. One thing they tried to do to protect workers was they installed a tent outside, which is something a lot of other meatpacking plants did. They were kind of all talking to each other throughout all of this and kind of sharing tips. But they set up this tent, but no one used it. Partly because management didn't give the workers enough time to actually walk outside to use it. They have a very short lunch break, so they're kind of rushing. And they didn't require it in any sense. So they set up this tent, but just it wasn't being used. And they didn't really do anything to make sure that workers were spreading out. One of the biggest things the CDC and OSHA recommended, was spacing workers out on the line just to get people away from each other. And in these emails, these records that Rachel was talking about, they make this point that it would take a year and a half, right, Rachel? It would take a year and a half to redesign their plant to make sure that they could do that. And they were like, well, we can't do that, because that's going to eat into their profits. So that's all what we found was they took half measures to really protect their workers. And the bottom line was really keeping the plant open and continuing that production. I'll talk a little bit about, Rachel mentioned all this reporting we were doing remotely. I was the one who traveled to St. Joseph because I lived the closest, and spent a couple days there reporting on the ground. And tons of reporters did that during the pandemic and much more than I did. But just to give a little insight into that, it was, there was lots of planning involved. We just made sure that I took every precaution. And my boss, Pam Dempsey, really kind of spearheaded that. She called the hotel I was going to stay at and made sure that all the employees were wearing masks, and that the dining area was closed off, and everything. And she bought me bags worth of masks and hand sanitizer and all that. Thank you, Pam, by the way. So so that was really helpful. When we were going into places where we thought, or when I was going into places where we thought there were major outbreaks, I wore 2 masks. I wore a face visor and gloves, which it's hard to talk to people when you got all this stuff. It's hard to emote with just your eyes, especially when there's a language barrier. But that's something we thought was necessary in order to protect ourselves. So, while we were also on the ground, that's when we spoke to Bernardo Serpa's wife, now widow. And, she was able to lay out for us his story. They actually met at a slaughterhouse in Cuba, and then they moved to the United States, and then worked their way to St. Joseph, but all their family was back in Cuba. And she was also able to kind of tell us when he went to the hospital and kind of what his experience was like. He, when he entered the hospital, he was 300 pounds, I believe. And after he was in a coma, and after he woke up from the coma, he was 150 pounds. The photos we have of him before and after are just incredible. The virus just took a huge toll on his body, and ultimately led to his death.
I think I want to add to, and I want to stunt the forward momentum of our conversation here, but just to kind of tie that back to what Rachel was saying, to accentuate the decision about sending workers back into plants. So, this is a case where there was a slow uptick. There was an initial group of people and a little bit more. And to its credit, actually, the Missouri, I think it's State Department of Health, at that time, tests were at a premium, and they made a decision to allocate resources and go to this plant and test every single person in this plant, try and nip this in the bud. And they get there, they test everyone, and they've sent them right back to work. And Rachel said, this accentuate, we're talking about 2 or 3 days to get test results, maybe a week, right? Shut the plant down for maybe a week, that level of time span, so you can know who is going to be sick and who is not going to be sick. And they didn't do that. And Bernardo was someone who was tested negative, went back into the plant, ended up being positive, very likely contracting it during that time period. So I think that was just with this really, I think we're talking about that production, right? That push for production over people. I think that was just a really clear indicator of the kind of decisions that we're talking about.
Well, and if I could piggyback, there's a couple points in the reporting that I even rereading the story kind of still level me. Because we had the emergency response records from when Arturo Chavez Valencia died, was literally dying. His heart was stopping in his home. We know that at the literal same moment in time that is happening, Triumph was on the phone with representatives for 2 Congress people from Missouri to try to push back on the guidelines that they were minimally implementing anyway. Since this story has come out, OSHA has released an investigation, which Sky got, which backs up a lot of our findings that Triumph was not taking these very critical steps early in the pandemic that would have nipped this in the bud and not allowed it to become, the last count that we have is more than 600 cases, although the company has tamped it down. In those records, it says, so we were able to speak with, well, in Bernardo's case, Bernardo before he died, but then the widows of the first and the most recent worker who died, but there are 2 more within a week of each other in July. And those OSHA records show that one of the gentlemen became infected in late April, continued working for a couple of days before he was told he was positive. He tested positive during this mass testing event, and then had a lengthy hospital stay and die. So that that allowing workers back into the plant really became a very critical thing to what we found.
And now we're playing tennis, but one last thing too,
Yes.
that was a guiding light for us in this. I think, there's a certain level of defense argument can be made. Early in the pandemic, nobody knew what was going on, right? It was very, very difficult. I mean, there's a lot of people to know what was happening. I think when we come back to in the decision not to close the plant, in the delay in the provision of PPE early on, in almost every instance, workers knew they were at risk. They were posting on social media. They were messaging health departments, the state and local, saying this is a problem. We are scared. It should not be done this way, and it wasn't. So whatever, hindsight 2020, Monday morning quarterbacking, all that kind of stuff, workers knew that they were being put at risk throughout this process.
If I can interject here, we got a call in February of last year from workers at a Greenlee plant, a JBS Greenlee plant in Colorado, and they were saying that a lot of workers were getting sick at this meatpacking plant, and that the conditions were getting bad. And we at that time said, okay, let's see what happens. A week later, this is February, one of the workers who had worked there for 36 years died. And after he died, we contacted the plant, and they were telling us exactly, they knew they were getting sick. They knew something was happening. They had no masks, no PPE. There was no social distancing. They were literally shoulder to shoulder. And if anybody's been to a meatpacking plant, and I've been to 7 of them, and it's terrible conditions. If you think about up in Sinclair, the jungle, think about that as in terms of the issues that we were dealing with when these workers. So I went to Greenlee, Colorado. We asked for a meeting with the plant managers. They refused to meet with us. And therefore we contacted the local county health officials and the governor of Colorado regarding the conditions there. And by this time now, 3 workers had died. Over 200 had tested positive. The plant was refusing to test the workers and was telling the workers they had to go to the local county health facility. And at that time, there was not a whole lot of vaccine tests. COVID tests available. And therefore, the problem grew. And it took the county health official closing the JBS plant down for a week, and the governor interfering to be able to close that plant down. And after that plant was closed down, then we got a call from Waterloo, Iowa. Same scenario at a Tyson plant there in Iowa. People getting sick, same issues going on. And at that time, we figured out that COVID was spreading throughout the meatpacking industry. We sent a letter to the top 5 companies in the US, JBS, Tyson, Smithfield, Cargill, and beef producers, and told them we needed PPE for everybody, on-site testing. If they were tested positive, paid leave. If they were hospitalized, workers' comp would cover that. And we made a list of demands. Only 3 companies responded. The others refused. We also asked to inspect the plants, which we were able to do. But now, remember, by this time, we're now in June or July, over 200 workers have died nationally. Thousands have tested positive. And then we found out that in Waterloo, Iowa, that the plant managers were betting how many workers, after President Trump put down the Work Defense Act, that they had to go to work. They couldn't work from home like me and you. They had to be at the plant, and if not, they were going to be fired. So there was no closures. And as a result of that, the plant managers were betting on how many workers would die, how many would get sick, and how many would require hospitalized. And it was a full bet. And I called up the CEO of Tyson, Noel White, and told him, I said, what's going on? And he fired the plant managers. He went down there. We met with them. And we said, this has to change, this whole atmosphere that these are essential workers, but they're also disposable workers. That's a contradiction. We can't allow that. And they did make changes, but it took roughly 4 or 5 months for those changes to occur. Smithfield actually acted the fastest by having on-site testing, paid leave, plexiglass between the workers and so on. But it was definitely something that, but for getting the attention of the press and getting to those small towns like Waterloo, Iowa, who probably nobody ever heard of, or Greenlee, Colorado, or Cactus, Texas, or so on, that really brought attention. But let me tell you, OSHA was AWOL. They were supposed to protect the workers, and they did not. Complaints to OSHA went unheard. They never filed anything against any of these companies. And the result was these workers got sick. Some died. I don't know the last number, but I was over several hundred. And thousands got sick and required hospitalization. So this is an issue that continues still today. We are still monitoring it on a day-to-day basis and seeing if there's any more outbreaks, but it does appear to have tempered down. And we did make a demand for President Biden to have vaccinations of all the meatpacking workers as essential workers, because if you're fighting about paper, toilet paper at the store, think about when you don't have that steak or that pork chop or that chicken leg at the grocery store. And that's what was facing the U.S. back in July. And that's when I think the President Tyson put that letter in the New York Times saying that there were the danger of the food production being cut down. It was never there, but there was an issue there. And hopefully the workers will be vaccinated. The PPE will be continue to be provided to everybody, and safety procedures will be on there. And we count on the media and the press to keep the pressure on and put the spotlight on these companies to make sure they protect the workers. Thanks.
Can I throw in sorry, it's great. Can I throw a historical point about this? I mean, first, I need to praise this crew of reporters for this outstanding contribution they've made to knowledge. And I think that it's a good thing they weren't involved in the industry before, because if they had been, they might have not been so shocked at what they saw. And the shock is part of it, what they're communicating here, not just in their words, but I see their facial expressions and the vehemence in their voice. I mean, that's genuine and that's real. And then you've uncovered a tragedy, a preventable tragedy. And I want to thank you for doing that. It's great. I could go on about history, but I want to, by the way, I have been in Waterloo, Iowa. I have been in St. Joseph, Missouri. I've been researching meatpacking for 40 years. But I wanted to have a very small point about this failure of company response, the sending workers back in, what they did, because it's a very specific reason why that happened. And that has to do with changes in the inspection of health and safety that took place in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. And Kyle, I've talked to you a lot, but I haven't talked to you about this point in particular. One of the things that happened in the 80s was not only a reduction in money for OSHA, but a shift in the responsibility of who was reporting on workplace injuries. In the 80s, what you had was a shift towards self-reporting on the part of companies. What companies did is they recorded the injuries. They reported the results of their logs to OSHA. And if they were high, then they would be investigated. But if they were below a certain level, they just kept track of this, and that's all that happened. And of course, there was widespread cheating that went on, and some of the companies were caught doing that and fined. But what this did, the way the companies really worked their way around it, and they did this for decades, is by getting workers who are sick or injured to report to work and giving them light duty. So if you hurt yourself in some way at a workplace, you would be asked to come in the next day. You'd be paid, which was, if you don't have a sick day, that's nice. And you'd be given a job sitting in the office, or you would be doing something like that. And what that did was kept your injury reports down. And it kept you below the level where you might be investigated. And this becomes part of meatpacking culture for decades and decades. Adding to that is the pressure on them from the insurance companies. So workman's compensation, Domingo, when you say they can get workman's compensation, that doesn't help the companies, because those insurance companies are increasing their rates if they have high amounts of injuries. And I know these kind of conversations took place, and one of the main reasons companies have done things about ergonomic issues is because of the pressure of their insurance. So you put these two things together, and COVID comes along, and they look at it in the same frame. So you get a test, and you go right back to work. You're fine. We'll give you light duty. You're feeling a little sick. You've got a sore throat. We'll put you on another area of the job. That's the frame they have. And they're doing that in part because of the structure of government regulation of workplace injuries and illnesses in meatpacking, created an incentive for them to do so. Now, the companies also want to keep workers on there for lots of other reasons we could talk about, but there's a very specific element of government regulation that helped to generate this managerial approach. And this is a regulation that's been in place for since the 80s. We're talking almost 40 years. And so it's embedded in company policies. And that's the specific thing you saw, Kyle and Rachel, workers being sent back in because that was their framework, and it was fatal to so many workers.
Well, and the pandemic part of this, one thing I would add that we found that Triumph did, but they certainly were not unique among meatpacking plants, was rather than hazard pay, they offered attendance bonuses. So as the pandemic was starting and there became concerns about meat shortages and keeping up production, all those sorts of things, they were saying, if you come every shift of your work week this week, you get an extra $100. And that continued through June. even after the CDC specifically advised against that because it would incentivize people to come in while ill rather than stay home.
And would keep their OSHA numbers down.
Yeah.
I mean, again, that's where that's coming from. You're worried about the OSHA numbers, you're worried about triggering those inspections. And so everything you do is intended to keep those kind of numbers down. And infectious disease time, not going to work.
And actually, what happened in Greeley, Colorado, is that they denied the workers' compensation for the widows of the workers who died, saying, well, we don't know if they got COVID at the plant or if they got COVID at the city or at home. And they're still fighting those fights all over. That's a big issue right now.
That's the same thing. That's been the industry responses. And Sky can speak to this, but Triumph Foods was very concerned about an apartment complex where a significant portion of the workers all lived. And so they were saying, oh, it's because of how the workers are socializing when they're not here. That's why everybody's getting sick. And they're even in the OSHA report that we got that, kind of confirmed, the things we're reporting, that's what the company was offering as a reason that, they couldn't rule out that they got it in the plant, but they also think it was outside of the plant.
And we had a whole other story where we just looked at OSHA, and I think I found a lot of the same things that Domingo talked about. And there's a lot, I'll try to find the link and drop it in. But I know a really big thing was about the lack of reporting that we're talking about. I think even prior to COVID, with things like the flu or other conditions, it was very sometimes up to the enforcement of OSHA. Do you have a regional administrator who really encourages companies to report and let them decide if somebody got sick in the plant, or do they kind of let people go under the radar a little bit? And there were some policy changes too, not just enforcement, that basically resulted in a lot of COVID deaths not getting reported. The company makes a snap judgment based on what criteria, not really sure. Was someone, did someone fall ill? Did they get the COVID in the plant or at the bowling alley or whatever? And if they decide against it and don't report it, there's very little mechanism for that to be investigated or anything like that. And I think it resulted in a lot of low numbers and lack of investigations. And the investigation was a whole other component, but I don't want to get too much down that trail here. So.
No, I think this has all been really, helpful. And, Roger, I wanted to thank you for providing that context because, as Domingo mentioned, the jungle, Upton Sinclair, which I think for many Americans, that's kind of what we know about meatpacking when someone mentions it. And that book's over 100 years old. So, it's crazy to see, the gaps that we have in our knowledge about what's going on in this industry that, as we very well know, is very vital to our everyday lives. And I was wondering, Roger, if you would, I know you shared information about, how legislation in the 80s has contributed to this, but I was wondering if you would be able to share some more information about how, historic conditions in these plants has led to what we've seen these past few months, this past year, really.
Well, first let me say that Upton Sinclair was a reporter who covered a strike in 1903 and 1904 and was shocked at the conditions because he didn't know anything about meatpacking. And it's after that he wrote the Jungle. So I have been encouraging this team to write a book because you discover these things and you need to put these things out there. I'm not sure you'll be as successful as the Jungle. That's pretty high standard, but it needs to be said. Well, this is the history of meatpacking industry in about a minute, but I'll just put it to you this way, that the way I think about meatpacking history is sort of in three big periods, huge periods, talk about over 150 years, that if you start with the industrialization, this will be in a minute, believe me, this will be quick. But industrialization of meatpacking really starts happening in the 1870s after the Civil War, up until really, if you could take that up until the 1930s, it's non-union, it's a brutal industry. It is run by something which labor economists call the drive system, which is kind of what it sounds, is you drive the workers as hard as you can. And unions are there and they've been defeated any number of times. That said, these are still jobs that are good enough to attract millions and millions of immigrants and African-American workers, people who did not have other options in the labor market, like your Triumph workers. It's paying $16.25 an hour. That's what that ad said. That's pretty decent pay in today's world, especially if you don't speak English. So just like now, just like back then, workers, Polish, Lithuanians, Croatians, all these different ethnic groups, Mexicans went into meatpacking because they could find jobs, and they didn't think they're going to make careers in meatpacking. They were there because they wanted to make some money to bring their families over and to start work, just like these immigrants today. But the work is brutal, and the company's attitude is to wear workers out. In other words, you're not worried about creating a workforce which lasts for a long time. You're willing to take labor turnover. You're willing to accept injuries. In many places, there are policies really where they fired older workers and replaced them with newer workers because there was nothing wrong. There was nothing illegal about this. No workplace protection. That is an early era. And so it's easy to say it's simply a Sinclair story, but it's also built a lot of immigrant African American communities because they put up with it and they were able to do something with that. That's a period one. Period two, I'd call the union era, which really is 1940s to the 1980s, where labor organizations are able to organize this industry. And they do a number of things without getting into the industry, into the details of it. One thing they do is they elevate the pay so that meatpacking moves from being sort of a poorly paid rough job to a quite decently paid job for the blue collar working class. Very important job for unskilled men and women to do well enough to buy vacation homes, send their children to college, and that whole important period. From this standpoint, what they also do is they take some control over what's happening on the shop floor. You know, they're able to, stewards and other means, they're able to reduce the pace of work and step in the middle of situations that these reporters have described to protect workers against companies that were focused on the production and thereby overlooking problems of safety. This is a huge thing. And then I looked at the data and the status of meatpacking's injury, you know, as a dangerous workplace declines significantly in the course of the union era for reasons you might expect, because the union's defending its workers, the union's present there, it reduces the pace of work, so on and so forth. That's a very important period of time. Now that goes away in the 1980s. And again, this is a whole story in itself. And the industry is largely deunionized by the 1990s, or the unions that remain are vastly weakened in their power. And you return to this drive system. And when that happens, labor turnover skyrockets. Labor turnover during the union era was very, very low because you had seniority, you had wage increases, you had contract, you had all these benefits that were there. A lot of the wages decline, the workplace becomes much harsher, and a lot of the workers who have options, white and African-American workers, flee the industry for other kinds of jobs, which opens the door to a new wave of immigrant labor, just like you have in the early 20th century, just like in Sinclair's era there. You have a lot of Mexican immigrants who are legalized by the IRCA Act, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. They are able to get jobs in meatpacking. They're legal workers. I emphasize these are legal workers who get in there. Then there are all the refugees who are the result of U.S. domestic policies and foreign policy, Vietnam, Laos, Central America, who all come into this country with the right to work. They are not undocumented. They are legal refugees, a legal right to work. But of course, they don't have the language, they don't have the skills, they don't have connections. Just like the Croatians, just like the Lithuanians, they go into meatpacking. And that's kind of the world we have today. Again, to take this is what you have right now is you don't have a standardization of pay. You don't have a union presence that can ameliorate these kind of conditions. And you also have an immigrant population that has limited job options. And so if you close these plants and if you do things to restrict these operations and the plants close, these workers don't have a lot of options. So that intimidates workers and makes it more likely that these workers will accept or not protest conditions that are dangerous to them. Of course, if the conditions look like they might be fatal, which is what's happened there, that's when you get the phenomenon of people saying, hey, what's going on there? So that's the long range. Let me just say one other thing, again, in context. Meatpacking has always been labor intensive. And all the talk about automation, to me, is sort of overblown. The basic problem in meatpacking is this, is you've got an animal, and these animals vary in size, and they have to be cut up into pieces for us to eat. And to this day, it's easier to have people take pieces of the animal, insert them into knives, put them into the machines, than to have machines do that kind of work. The eye and the hand, very powerful combination. The hand knows just how hard or soft to hold something. Very hard to roboticize that. So what's happened in meatpacking in terms of automation is skill is often taken away because you use machines rather than people with knives. But you still need all sorts of workers to move things throughout the plant. And if you've been in meatpacking, you'll see that workers are standing shoulder to shoulder because you got to move things from point A to point B. All that makes the process of segregation, which is required under COVID, difficult. Very difficult to reorganize. It requires a rather dramatic reorganization of the workplace, which of course is possible. But these plants have been built around that notion that you can put workers shoulder to shoulder. And therefore, when this happens, it's a challenge to try to figure out how to do that. And that's why you have these kind of conditions there. Now, it's really a matter of how companies want to do that. But that, I think, is part of some of the, I mean, if you ask me, I could go on, but those are, I think, are the key things I'd mention.
And I wanted to piggyback off what Roger said, because coming from our perspective, we noticed some of the same things with the workforce. So we had that list of hundreds, maybe over 1,000 employees that we just started looking them up however we could and trying to contact them. And oftentimes the immigrant minority members of the workforce would be, I think, be reluctant to talk to us. They were still working there. They still needed the job. One of the gentlemen who died from COVID at the Triumph plant, I had several family members who were working there, sons who were still there. And oftentimes people who talked to us were people who had left the plant, right? So people maybe fresh out of high school, thinking about college, I'll just try to make some money. And when COVID goes down, they get out of there. They find some other line of work. They can speak English, or they have more social safety net, and they can go, they don't have to keep doing it. So we definitely saw anecdotally that same kind of divide, even among the employees that had been there.
And this is, they're both right. This is a largely immigrant workforce, and Triumph Foods is no exception. At least half of their workers are immigrants. And I think there's like 5 other primary languages spoken in the plant besides English. So just from a practical standpoint, unfortunately, none of us 3 are bilingual in any way that was meaningful. So we had other reporters helping with Spanish language interviews, Sky had a translator when he was there. But then one thing I'm actually really grateful that we did is our story was also published in Spanish, because we wanted the workers, at least workers who spoke Spanish, to be able to read it. And specifically, some of the people we spoke to for the story, namely the widows of Bernardo Serpa and Arturo Chavez Valencia, are primarily Spanish speakers. And so that was really important to us and help us reach the people who are most impacted by what the company was doing.
Yeah, I'd like to, I think, dig in more on that, with the context that Roger provided, looking at the other part of the story, which is, once you have all of these facts and figures, how do you present them, and how do you make this story meaningful for, people who don't know about this issue, but also, like you were talking about, Kyle and Rachel, how do you establish trust, with people like Bernardo and, Arturo's widow. So I was just wondering if you could share, especially for folks in the audience who may be interested in pursuing an investigative story like this, which requires that, personal narrative in order to get this information across. If you could just speak about the process.
I'll jump in, and maybe Sky can, because he spoke with Maritza, who is Bernardo's widow. It's really challenging. It's really challenging when there's a language barrier, and to a large degree, we're relying on some of our other reporters. Frank from the Midwest Center, we have a reporter, Kevin Crow, who is bilingual and did a lot of the interviews. I think it's trying to report as much as you can while still being a person and being sympathetic. It is very difficult to try to reach out to someone after the loss of a loved one, and then to talk about those things. We went back and forth, a lot of reporting, like just trying to get all the detail we could, and all that doesn't get into the story, but asking Gabriela many times what happened the day her husband collapsed into her home and died, while EMS were working on him. And that's really difficult stuff. You kind of alluded to this, but one of the challenges with a project like this too is how you make this all fit together, right? I spent how long talking about public records and what we learned and what we could glean about the response, but we have these really like heartbreaking stories of what these workers and their families were enduring. And that was a challenge. I mean, organization, I moved my computer, but I still have taped up in the wall. I printed out a massive timeline we had created so that we knew every day, like during these critical periods, what was happening, and, writing all over that, and it's writing and rewriting and tweaking, and the story changed. You know, we were pretty far down the road on a draft, and I was up late one night doing my circling of obit checks when I saw Burrow was in there, and that was pretty crushing to read. You know, I had been on the phone with him. He was you know, very upset with the way the company had treated him, the turn that his life had taken. Maritza had told Sky, you know, he's depressed, he's trying to deal with all this. So we were heartbroken to learn that, but then that meant not ripping up the story, but certainly making significant changes to it. So it's definitely a challenge to try to corral all of it.
Yeah, to piggyback off Rachel's point about, I mean, talking to these people, it is very challenging. You know, we called almost 700 people and end up talking to a dozen. You know, a dozen agreed to talk to us. In Maritza's case, Bernardo's widow, you know, it really helped. I think that she like wanted to get his story out. At least in my experience, I mean, that's kind of the person you're looking for, is someone who is, I mean, she was angry. I mean, like, her husband was in the hospital and she hadn't seen him in a long time, like a month. And she was like, she wanted his story told, I think, and wanted someone to hold the company accountable. So, you know, it was still tough, but, you know, like, she answered all of our questions. We asked some pretty personal questions, some pretty hard questions, and she was game for all of them. So I think it's kind of a case by case basis. So you know, sometimes you'll find someone like Maritza who is such an advocate for her husband and wants as much information out there as possible. And then you find other people who, you know, just who just aren't willing to go there. Like, for instance, you know, Kyle mentioned the person who died, who has several sons, I think, who still work at the plant. I mean, we located where that man lived and where his family lived, and we went to go knock on his door. And as soon as we talked to his wife, she was just like, nope, please leave. And I mean, we just left. I mean, she was just, you know, it was not worth it to try to convince her otherwise. She was just, you know, and I think that gets back to what Rachel was saying, being a human being. You know, it's clear when someone is in too much pain to tell their story. Yeah.
And I want to say specifically about the bravery of Gabrielle Ramirez. She's the wife of Arturo Chavez Valencia, and he was the first employee to pass away from COVID. And she works at the plant. I guess we haven't talked to her in a little while now, but she was still working at the plant. She was going to work there the day we published the story. And we had a lot of conversations about making sure she understood potential implications, right, of this, what's going to happen when the story comes out. And we were saying, we can't imagine this company is going to retaliate against her, but stranger things have happened, and it was a real concern for us. And I think we did what we thought was right, to just make sure she was fully aware, that she was fully comfortable, that she knew everything. And she had the bravery to tell a really tragic story. And it was inspiring.
I just want to thank you for your sensitivity, because it's very tempting for someone who wants to be successful at muckraking or history or something like that to view the people they're writing about as steps on the way. And because you can, of course, walk away afterwards. You can publish your story, and if something bad happens to them, it doesn't affect you. You've done fine. And bad things have happened, you know, because of that lack of care. These are people who are vulnerable. And I think there's a responsibility of those who write and talk about them to not make them more vulnerable. If anything, to try to be a source of strength.
Thank you for saying that. I think a couple things stuck with me or endured with us through this project. One was that vulnerable position that the people we were talking to were in. I think it was early on, Kyle had spoken to a historian who said, you know, just watch. I don't think this can be a shortage thing. You're going to see this industry sacrifice their workers. And that really was a turning point for us when this became a line of reporting, not about would we all have hamburger, but about what is the cost of that? What is the human cost? And so I think the Triumph story is a good example of contrasting the relatively vulnerable position of these workers while their company has the ear of government and is doing everything they can to keep working. I think too, we are not sensitive, or we are not insensitive to the climate that we're in, or the attitudes towards immigrants, refugees, and people in our country. And these are people. And as much as we could, we wanted to humanize them. We were reading the transcript from one of the first long interviews with Gabriella, and she was talking about all the effort she was taking. She put her husband in one bedroom, and they have 3 sons. And she put the 3 sons in the other bedroom, and she was going between them, and she was wearing a mask, and she had gloves on, and she was taking all these extreme efforts to care for her family. And I don't know anybody who couldn't relate to what you doing the same thing, what difficult situation that would put you in if you had to do that in your family. And so I think we tried, at least, for the reporting team, tried to really center that the choices the companies were making were putting these people who are already vulnerable and, even worse and very difficult, and in some cases, life-ending situations.
Yeah, thank you. For sharing that. And I hope it's helpful for anyone. Obviously, I hope that these situations don't become more and more prevalent, but I do hope that if they do, the reporters, the journalists who cover them do so with the same sensitivity, because I think it does make all the difference. And I do wish LULAC President Garcia was still here. I think he had some technical difficulties to, speak to those issues that the largely immigrant workforces face, and how, like you said, Rachel, they're already vulnerable, and how this has just really shed light on that reality, unfortunately. I do see we have a question from the audience, and I want to remind folks that we do still have about a half an hour. So if you do have questions, please continue sharing those. But this question comes from Madison, and I think Roger, she's curious to learn more about labor unions. Specifically, what has the role of labor unions been in protecting workers during the pandemic? Or maybe in the past, how successful have the unions been in advocating for workers? I don't know if you want to take that. I thought that would be up your alley.
I'll start, but I think some of the reporters here have knowledge in that topic as well. Well, the United Food and Commercial Workers is the most significant union in meatpacking these days, and they represent workers in a variety of plants. The problem that they have in terms of exercising any power is each of these plants has their own contract with the company. They do not have a contract, say, of all the JBS plants, and have a common contract which expires at the same time and standardizes wages and working conditions across those plants. That's the kind of contract that existed during the union era that I would talk about. So this means that if they represent workers at one plant, they don't have a lot of power, because if they were to strike at one plant, the company could simply increase production at the other plants. And so they do represent workers, but their structural power is much weaker, than it used to be. But they've held on. And from what I understand and what I've read, they have been very aggressive at arguing for worker safety in this pandemic. Extremely aggressive in doing whatever they can, of course, in the plants that they represent to have workers protected, but doing something which I think is really important, acting as an advocate for all workers in their industry, and even more generally, all the workers that they might represent in their other jurisdictions, to protect them against the COVID, because workers need an advocate. Workers need strength. They need some resources. We've talked about this. These are vulnerable people who do not have the capacity to exercise power on their own. And if you have institutions that step in for you and speak for you and can use your resources and people who are skilled to do things for you, you're going to appreciate that. It's going to make a difference. And so I think the USCW has done quite a bit in that context, even though they don't have the strength that necessarily do that, to try to improve these conditions. And the bits of information that I've heard from people who've been covering this is that they've seen a great surge of interest in the UFCW because of their activities around these issues. And this, I just say, this is historical. I mean, this is not something new that unions get credit from workers because they step in around working conditions and they make difference in the shop floor relations. Often what can make work miserable are conditions that can be corrected. Even if the pay isn't great, there's all sorts of things that can happen in a factory setting that unions can correct that make things better for workers. And the UCW has been working this way in a while. Unions in general understand this, and they saw COVID as an obligation and an opportunity to take this issue that unions are uniquely positioned to defend on and do things about it. I mean, also LULAC, you can see that they did a great deal. Again, very similar. Act as an advocate for workers. Use your organizational presence. Speak to the companies about these. Write to legislatures. So there's lots of ways, but I think the union has done quite a bit. Maybe Rachel, Kyle, Scott, you know more than I do about this as well, but I do think they've been outspoken on this issue.
Yeah, we spoke to the UFCW a lot, the national level, the regional and local levels. And frankly, a lot of what we know is because they told us. And so I can think of what I was talking about earlier about how there was problems with reporting to OSHA. So for instance, the UFCW told us about a plant in Nebraska where 4 people passed away from COVID and they're not on the books. And, you know, I think the company said a very protected kind of guarded statement, neither confirming nor denying, but we were only able to realize there was a gap in the reporting, right, of people passing away and actually reported government because a union told it to us. And I think oftentimes we talk to them, they feel like they did a pretty good job of being able to use the power they do have to get conditions improved in a lot of their plants. And they'll be the first to say that non-union plants, and we encountered the same thing, it's like a black box of info. It's very difficult to know anything. You know, all you can really do, I think, is cold call reporters. Hats off to journalism outlets that were able to get into some of those plants. I think we saw a lot, particularly, and Roger, I think there's historical reasons that you maybe told me about, that in the South and with poultry plants, there is just not a strong union presence. And we weren't able to learn a lot about that thing. So I think from our report, from my perspective, it seemed like there was a very clear difference between plants that had union presence and those that didn't in COVID.
Rachel, Sky, do you want to? No pressure. Just wanted to make sure I didn't cut you off. Yeah, I think I want to follow up on what you said, Kyle, about the poultry plants not having a strong union presence. Just, you know, out of curiosity, I know, Rachel, like you said, you're mainly on the sports beat, but you know, if this story has, you know, led you to, you know, maybe want to pursue similar stories, you know, like, for example, what's going on with the poultry plants, or, you know, something along the same lines. I'm just curious if it, you know, has made you want to examine other things, or if you've already through this picked up on, you know, other trends or issues that maybe aren't are going under the radar right now.
I think one of the ways we really have continued our reporting was to look at who's policing these companies, right? You know, Domingo mentioned before he left that OSHA really was AWOL, and everything in our reporting confirmed just a complete hands-off approach by that agency, which is responsible for protecting worker safety. Kyle's right, the poultry plants that are in the South are largely not unionized and much harder for us to get an insight into. But you know, OSHA, especially under a new administration, is being looked to be quite a bit stronger, take more enforcement action. That's something we're continuing to report on, you know, as that comes up. But you know, we've seen since the Upton Sinclair days, right? Like the profit motive for these companies sort of tells you, you know, the nexus of where their decision making will come from. It's up to state, federal government regulators to try to intervene to protect those workers. We saw that did not happen, but we're definitely keeping an eye on the extent to which that's changing.
Can I make one point about OSHA, since that's come up? The importance of this health and safety laws is that it imposes the same costs on all the firms in the industry. And that's really important, because if you have a firm that is philanthropic and its owners are well-meaning and they have all sorts of protections for workers that make it more expensive for them to operate, they're not going to survive in the long haul in a competitive industry. So you have to have some means to standardize the costs to firms so that they are incentivized to improve conditions that should be improved. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And there's really just two ways of doing that. One is through labor union contracts, and the other is through federal regulation. Federal. State regulation is not good enough because the firms can shift the production between different plants. They can decide to close plants in a particular state. Whipsaw is the word. So I would hope that these reporters follow what happens with OSHA and federal requirements, because that's where you could take some steps, very concrete steps against these abuses we described, such as the logs that you are able to conceal and things like that. That's regulation. That's within the bounds. You don't have to pass that in Congress. OSHA can adopt regulations that can then be imposed by inspectors who follow through with that. That's within the power of the government right now to do something with.
No, thank you for that, Roger, because I think that, really goes or connects well to a question we have from Alice, who asks, in your opinion, what would have been a better piece of legislation or executive order to support the workers in these plants' rights? And, you said it doesn't need to go through Congress necessarily. It could be regulation. And I'm curious if you could, specify what kind of regulation that might be, or if there's an example of something that has worked well before, if you could give us some information on that.
Well, I mean, I think you could permit OSHA to make unannounced inspections. I mean, that's not a small thing. They should be able to go into a company and say, okay, let's see what you got. Very important, power. Companies do that actually with people who are enforcing food standards, but not inspections. And you have to increase the number of OSHA people. I mean, that's kind of, ABC. You give them the power to go onto the plant, make inspections, which is a regulation, an OSHA regulation, and you hire more people to do that job, and you establish circuits where they do so. I mean, I'm staying away from legislation because I think anything that requires legislation is going to be way down the list given the kind of Congress that you have. And I just don't think it's realistic to expect miracles to happen. But you could do that. You also could do things through the National Labor Relations Board that now has completely different leadership under Biden. Has already completely changed the leadership of the National Labor Relations Board that would facilitate unions and workers having rights in these kinds of settings. So one of the big ones is that it's become very easy for firms to dismiss workers who support unions, which is technically against the rules, but it's very easy for them to do. You could impose NLRB, could impose new regulations, which make it very, very onerous. You could have, for example, you could have whistleblower rules, which I don't think you have now for workers in a plant. If you're in management, you could do that, but you need whistleblower rules. So say if these workers that Rachel and Kyle are talking about, they see something and they act as whistleblowers, and for them to be protected against retaliation by their firms would make it easier for these kinds of reporters to get informants and to find out what's going on. Doesn't solve the problem because if workers feel vulnerable, they won't protect that, but it creates some sort of protections. And all these things are regulations that could be adopted that could strengthen the workers, give them protection against dismissal, which is the biggest fear they have, and put more government eyes on what's happening inside these plants. All that shifts the balance of power. That's really what you're doing. You're trying to give the workers and their advocates a little more power in relationship to the firms to constrain the kind of rapaciousness that has been described here today.
This is some of the reporting that we've done toward the end of last year and into this year in terms of what OSHA can do within its current structure. The National Employment Law Project, someone there, Debbie Berkowitz, who we've spoken with many times, has estimated that OSHA has the fewest number of inspectors it has had in its entire existence. That's a funding problem to a degree, so they may need help from Congress on that. But actually going into these workplaces was not happening largely during the pandemic. We did reporting about OSHA doing these quote unquote virtual inspections, some of which, there's evidence that they didn't physically see the workplace. They just did what we're doing now and did a Zoom. The industry has faced very few fines or citations. Mostly that's because everything that was issued regarding COVID was a recommendation and not a requirement. Advocates have pushed for OSHA to issue what's called an emergency temporary standard, which would set requirements of things that the plants must do, and then they would have greater authority to cite or fine them. Those fines also carry a strong message. That's the reason why the Greeley plant and the Sioux Falls, which, they were 5-figure fines, but that's minuscule when you look at the profits that these companies bring in. That's why advocates are so critical of those, because it's saying this is a slap in the wrist. You don't actually have to do the things. When the agency issues strong fines and publishes them under the Trump administration, they had stopped issuing press releases. That has a big deterrent effect. So just last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration, OSHA, has announced an emphasis program where certain specific workplaces are going to get special focus, where they are going to prioritize in-person inspections, perhaps even like re-inspecting places where they had done these virtual inspections, during the pandemic. I think that advocates are still pushing for more and hoping for greater protections under this administration.
And just to put some numbers on them, I'm looking at our reporting from January. We knew at that point from Sky's tracker that 239 meatpacking workers had died, 45,000 contracted the coronavirus since the start of the pandemic. At that point, OSHA had issued citations to 5 meatpacking plants totaling $69,000. So you can see the level of difference between illness and the enforcement from OSHA.
I'm curious, Sky, too, since you were traveling to a lot of these places and, you spoke with a lot of folks who are working or had worked in these plants, if, they had, I guess, advice for the industry as a whole or things that they wanted to see done. If not, it's okay. I was just curious.
I mean, I think like the overall message from workers and advocates was like, you need to they just need to get away from each other. I think that's already been said, but that was kind of the resounding message I think we all got, was like, they need to shut the plants down, make sure these people are away from each other. And when they reopen them, make sure there's actually enough distance between people, a safe distance. I think that was kind of like the overarching message was, we just need to be spaced out. And it didn't really happen. That's why they started putting up barriers and stuff like that.
Thank you. I think we are getting close to the end of our time, and I'm not seeing any questions right now in the queue, but of course, if folks do have other questions, I do invite you to share those. But while we're waiting, and as kind of a way to wrap up, I just want to invite anyone to, share any closing thoughts you might have. For our team of reporters, this might be what you're working on next, or where folks can look to learn more. Roger, similarly, if you want to, point in a direction where our audience can learn more about this issue, especially from a historic lens, I think that'd be great. Or if you also want to share what you're working on, I know you have a great variety of research. So I just want to leave this opportunity for our panelists to give their final thoughts.
If it's okay, Holly, I see a question in the queue that I'd like to address from Ignacio. He asked about the pushback that we received from the companies. Sky can speak to generally, he had more contact with the Tyson JBS set of companies, but specifically when we were reporting about Triumph, they did not really engage with us. We asked multiple times for interviews with their executive leadership to ask about what we had found. When they declined to do that, we sent a detailed list of questions. Honestly, I believe it was around 100 questions of things we were trying to pin down, find out, to say, our reporting shows this. How do you explain it? They offered a, I believe, 7-page statement in response. It's linked to in the story, but they offered a 7-page statement, which very much touted the company's efforts, but did not substantively address the questions that we asked. In response to that statement, we went back to them again with a couple dozen more questions, to which they gave us another statement, again denying this. So they have not cooperated. And then it was earlier this month, I believe, when Sky obtained the OSHA records that largely show that the agency's inspection, which to the enforcement did not include a citation or fine, did confirm the things we were saying, that they were not providing or requiring masks, that they did not do temperature screening well, the types of things that were in our story. They again said, they would not cooperate and did not answer Sky's questions, but you guys could speak to maybe some of the other companies as well that we had some difficulty with.
Yeah, it varied a little bit. Like Smithfield and JBS would send like very kind of terse responses whenever we asked. Smithfield, they were kind of actually a little snarky with their online statements. I don't know if anyone has read those, but like they would put out very long statements on their website saying like all of this reporting like is just not accurate. And maybe Kyle or Rachel, you can think of specific examples, but they were just like, we can't space out workers. Where will we put them? It was literally stuff like that. They were very snarky in how they responded to the dangers their workers were going through. Tyson, at least earlier on, I found Tyson actually a little bit more willing to kind of engage. Like I spoke with their top spokesperson, multiple times on the phone. But it was always kind of on background. They were never really willing to like do like an actual interview. So they'd send statements like all companies do. There were times where like Tyson was not happy with our reporting. One time we put something in the story and like the spokesman just hated the way it was phrased, and it wasn't inaccurate. It was all factual. It was exactly what the guy said. But he ended up calling like Chris Davis on like a Saturday because he was so upset with how it was written. They were really sensitive about what was being reported, but not maybe so much about what was actually happening in their plants.
I'm going to say something here. Firms are always this way because they've built up this image among themselves. They like to think of themselves as being good people. They don't like to think of themselves as being bad people. They want to think they're giving the nation what they want. They're giving meat. These are difficult conditions, and these darn reporters are not respecting all the effort they're making. That's kind of their psychology, and it's wrong, but that's kind of the way they defend themselves. And I saw this with the poultry industry in Delaware, which I was reporting on some years ago, especially when it came to environmental issues. But what happens is you can wear them down. They will not admit this to you, but they will think, maybe we didn't do this right. And in private, they will probably have conversations with other people in the industry saying, well, maybe we should learn something from this because we're embarrassed. We are exposed. We are vulnerable to liability suits, wrongful death suits, I would say. If there's certainly people could bring civil action based upon the information, that you have there. And their lawyers and their people inside say, well, maybe you are fine. Maybe these reporters are unfair, but you should not allow yourselves to be exposed in this manner. You better be more careful about this. So it's while they'll tell you to get lost and that nothing's wrong there, you may well see changes in these plants as the insurance people and the attorneys and people say, you need to take steps so this doesn't happen again. You can't allow yourself to have another worker die in this manner because you've been warned. And if another one dies in this manner, you are really in trouble. You're in trouble for $1 million suit there. So the way this kind of changes happens is not because the industry is persuaded orally, because of the pressure that you exert from this. So they may have told you, Sky, to take a hike, but I bet inside there are conversations going on about how might we do better so that we don't find ourselves in the same situation in the future.
And I guess to that point, to Tyson's credit, late last year, they did create a new position called Chief Medical Officer, which was, supposed to look over kind of like their COVID testing and kind of how to best address their actions during the pandemic. And I think they filled it in December or January, something like that. So, to give them credit, they did create a new position, like a new person to kind of look at what was happening during the pandemic.
Yeah, but they're not going to recognize the labor unions.
Right.
They're going to fight against OSHA regulations. So what they want to do, again, this is American corporate history. They want to control the response. They don't want the government or they don't want labor unions doing it. So when you embarrass them like that, they will take some steps for that purpose. But still, they're going to be very resistant to any sort of external regulation. That's just the psychology of these non-union firms or firms that really in the modern era there. So I'm not surprised at your response. And then bully for you for sticking forward and putting it to them, and leaning on them to do something.
I appreciate what you said, Roger. It helps fill up my bank of concern about who's listening to what we're doing. So I hope you're right. But this whole conversation has reminded me of the Triumph Facebook page, which was an interesting place and goes back to the concept of the workers new. I mean, prior to this, it seemed like they were, proud of their immigrant workforce. They would feature countries that people came from, and they would talk about the economic benefits that they provide to the town. And you saw a lot of, I think, even among their workers, appreciation for the job. I'm sure, people who maybe had a negative opinion weren't putting it on the Facebook page, but, there was this certain veneer of a great company. And as COVID starts to come in, you just start to see these comments start to get in there. Hey, where's our PPE? Hey, people are coughing in the plant, worried. And there was one particular post where it's like, it just changed. It just that, and I think that's, we're reporters, especially, like I said, we haven't covered this industry before. It's tough to know which way is up sometimes. That's the guiding thing. When you see the people who work in these plants posting on middle of April, when people are figuring out, we need this is a concern, that makes it really clear. And I think for me, lends a lot of when the company starts pushing back, and some of them, I won't get into the inside baseball, some of the conversations we've had with some of the public relations people in these companies, but that's the thing you can fall back on, is you can't explain that away, right? That the workers knew these conditions were unsafe at the time.
I think to your question, Holly, before I jumped in, a couple things have stuck with me, or I think we're sort of guiding during this. If you remember what it was like at the beginning of the pandemic, or even last spring, we are relatively privileged. We can work from home. Our lives have been minimally impacted. Our COVID exposure is low. And there's all this rhetoric about like feeding America and our heroes who are essential workers. And there were people who their jobs required them to take these risks. These are some of those people who were bearing the brunt of the cost. And we should all know what that cost is. I think our reporting showed the rhetoric in the industry very much played up the like meat shortage part, while ignoring this part. And we're a very rich nation. We wouldn't have starved if we didn't have hamburger for a little bit or something like that. So I think that's the first thing, is really centering, what are the experiences of the people who everyone is saying, these are essential, these are heroes, we're thankful. Okay, well, please look at what these people are dealing with. And then I think the other thing too is this war on, someone I was talking with pointed out, even if you are a heartless human being and have no sympathy for the experiences of these workers, it matters to you, right? Like, we're in this pandemic and we're all connected. And if you don't control the outbreaks in these plants, you don't control it in your small rural town. If you don't control this outbreak in a nursing home, in a prison, in these congregate facilities where we know it spreads, it's going to affect you. And just look at, where coronavirus has gone in our country. I think one of the interesting thing in meatpacking now is prioritization for vaccination or not. Some states like Kansas, for example, put meatpacking workers in one of the first groups because of this exact concern. Others have not, and I'd be, interested to see how they fare. But I think those two things have been pretty lasting impressions from our reporting on this.
And I think for me, as I go back towards environmental reporting, I mean, I conceptually understood industrial agriculture before, but this was like eye-opening. I mean, how many millions of pounds, how many hundreds of thousands of animals a day? I mean, it is crazy. And I know for me personally, when I'm at the grocery store aisle in the meat section now, man, I spend half an hour there because I can't, I'm looking over everything and trying to make really responsible decisions. But I think for me to understand just the scale of it and how these entire supply chains are set up, where if you have a hiccup, I mean, the animal just has this like prime slaughter time period. If it takes too long, it's worthless because it's no longer standard size enough to go into the plant and get processed. I mean, it is a clockwork. It is mechanical, and I think for the environmental perspective, I think, assuming I will run into cover issues like that in the future, I think it just gives me a better appreciation of the scale of that industry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably gonna sound like a broken record, but I do the same thing Kyle does when I go to the store now. Making sure that it's not from a company that's had a huge outbreak. My girlfriend kind of rolls her eyes at me now because I've done it so much. And also, like, to Rachel's point, like, like it's I think pretty early on, it was very clear like who was going to get the short end of the stick when it came to this. So that's really stood out. I mean, like, if you want some numbers, the CDC put out a report last summer where 90% of the meatpacking workers who'd been infected were minority, and I think 60% of that was Hispanic. So it's not someone who looks like me. It's really the people who kind of do the jobs we don't want.
If I can make a point here about reporting and all that, go back to the jungle. When Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, he was outraged because he'd seen a strike, and he learned something about the poor conditions of the workers. But what got the public was his descriptions of what happened to the food. And afterwards, he was quoted as saying that I aimed for the nation's heart, but I hit them in the stomach instead. And that's the outcome there. And then, of course, the story goes away and people forget about it because they really want that steak. They really don't want to think about what it takes there. That's, of course, is Rachel's point there. I would hope that you, as a group or the newspaper, will continue to follow the story, because otherwise people will forget and they'll focus on the food, they'll focus on that. But once these workers are past the COVID dangers, they're still facing the kind of conditions in these plants. They're still facing repetitive motion disorders. They're still facing ulcerative injuries. Their wages have not gone up. Their ability to defend themselves in the case of layoffs or production have not changed. So if there's going to be a residue of this, I mean, it's going to require some legislation, some organization, and also continued attention to workers that are in, let's face it, small towns in the Midwest, that in the South, that people don't go to, flyover country, as you might put it, Waterloo, Iowa, St. Joseph, Missouri, places that are not on the radar, and so they will be forgotten. And it's going to take reporters like you all to make sure that they're not forgotten and that what they're doing remains in public awareness.
Thank you all so much. Truly, it's been a pleasure just learning more. And I know I'm going to keep following this. And I hope that, our audience members here right now and anyone watching this later take some of this with them as well. Yeah, the video of this conversation will be online at pulitzercenter.org in the coming days, so do feel free to share widely. I also wanted to thank my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Sean and Joseph, who was our producer for today's session. We appreciate you all in the audience for joining us today. And for those of you who are able, please remember we are a nonprofit journalism organization, and so we depend on donor support. If you donate today, you can become a Pulitzer Center champion. Also, please check out pulitzercenter.org/events for more information on upcoming webinars. We have one tomorrow with the McGill Public Health Programs and George Washington University about overcoming barriers to distribution of the COVID vaccine. So do invite you to sign up for that. Much more on our website, lots of them free registration. So do please check that out. And finally, we would love it if you could keep your window open for a few moments to take a brief survey after we officially end today's session. Thank you again for being with us today, and we hope you'll join us again soon. Bye.